Coming up next, you'll see Dick Cheney, the Secretary of Defense, as he speaks to members of the National Press Club at a luncheon today here in Washington. After his brief remarks, Secretary Cheney takes questions from the National Press Corps.
Vera, I appreciate very much having the opportunity to spend some time with all of you today. This is my first appearance before the National Press Club as Secretary of Defense. It's been, I believe, 1 year and 5 days since I took the oath of office, and it clearly has been a momentous year. Sometimes it seems like 10. But on occasion, when I think the going's a little tough and a little heavy out there and the slings and arrows are flying about my head as a result of the difficult job I have, I remember always, of course, that it could be worse. I could be the chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts. So well, let me begin today. First of all, I do have some remarks I want to make on our current situation with respect to national security and defense. Let me emphasize at the outset, though, that while I do have some rather pointed commentary in here about my friends and former colleagues on Capitol Hill, the speech today was not written in response to my good friend Sam Nunn, who I understand delivered a speech on the floor of the Senate this morning. That's not to say I agree with everything Sam said. I haven't read his speech yet, but everybody should understand that this speech was prepared before I knew Sam was giving one this morning. So I would urge everybody to recognize that this was not crafted with that purpose in mind. But obviously, if the shoe fits, wear it, Sam. So we're on the verge of a new era, I think, in American history, with democratic ideas finding their way into the farthest reaches of the communist world, with our most potent adversary facing internal crises of monumental proportions, and with the threat of sudden attack on the Central Front in Europe lower than at any time in the last 40 years, we obviously are looking at what could be the end of the Cold War. More to the point, these developments, I think, are signs of a victory for the West and for the United States and our allies in the Cold War. And victories are obviously occasions for both confidence and pride, and I think we have some justification for both. But along with pride, I think we also feel some uncertainty. What President Bush has called the revolution of 1989 swept away so much that was ugly in our world that we have good reason to wonder about what might come next. And as the revolution swept away the ugly, it brought us much that is good. America stands at the center of a widening circle of freedom, the President said. It's a circle we must be certain continues to grow. I don't think I've made a speech since taking this job a year ago without recognizing these changes and discussing in some detail exactly what the implications are for our military. And yet some of my former colleagues in Congress can't give a speech without claiming that our defense budget has not been responsive to the dramatic events in the Kremlin and Eastern Europe. Some of my friends on Capitol Hill work overtime, crafting cuter nuggets to drive home their claim that the administration is too slow to react to global change. Since reacting to change translates for some in Congress into cutting the defense budget, let me begin by reminding everyone today exactly what we have already cut. Since I became Secretary, I've cut some $231 billion out of our 5-year defense plan. For 1990 and 91 alone, I've recommended that we terminate 20 different weapons programs. We're in the process of closing 86 military bases in the United States and looking at closing another 47 bases in the United States and overseas. We've cut 60,000 military personnel. If we follow the President's 5-year defense plan, the plan that some in Congress say doesn't cut fast enough, defense spending as a share of GNP and as a percentage of the federal budget will fall to the lowest levels since before Pearl Harbor. Now, does Congress really believe it's safe to move below that level? The fact is that we've heard a lot of bold talk about cutting the overall defense budget, but every time I actually try to cut something, I have a fight on my hands. Some of the members who are biggest advocates of deep cuts are the ones who yell loudest when it comes time to cut something in their district. For example, we want to take account of the changing threat in Eastern Europe by ending our production of the weapon systems most appropriate for that theater, specifically our main battle tank. We already have 7,900 M1 Abrams tanks in the inventory. We are reducing the number of divisions in the Army. We are getting ready to withdraw forces from Europe. We don't need any more Abrams tanks. But doing that, closing down the M1 tank production line, might cost jobs in some congressman's district or some senator's state. So the result is a major roadblock as we try to restructure our forces for the future. My friend Les Aspin is the most critical this year, claiming we are not moving fast enough on our cuts. But if you look at the performance, if you look at real cuts, his committee has the worst track record in terms of actually supporting administration reductions in the defense budget. Last year, the committee tried to put back in the budget everything I cut out. In fairness to Les, he supported my efforts to cancel or terminate programs. Unfortunately, the majority of his committee did not support him. What Congress gives oftentimes is complaints instead of solutions. If our critics would actually look at what we are doing in the department to restructure our forces for the future, they would see a complete rethinking of missions and strategies. We have major program reviews underway for the Advanced Tactical Fighter, the A-12 aircraft, the C-17 transport, and the B-2 bomber. We're also looking at the experimental light helicopter of the Army, an SDI. These studies should be finished within the next few weeks, and their conclusions will be provided to Congress in time to be taken into consideration as Congress marks up the defense bill later this year. In our long-term program reviews, we are doing a thoroughgoing analysis of each service's budget, force structure, and procurement plans. In general, we are reevaluating our force structure and long-term national requirements. 2 days ago, the President forwarded to the Congress a report entitled National Security Strategy of the United States. 2 weeks ago, Congress received the Joint Military Net Assessment for 1990. Both reports, one public, one top secret, spell out in some detail the administration's views with respect to the future and our military requirements. Now for a moment, let's look at those requirements. For the sake of argument, let's grant the optimist all of their assumptions. Let me sketch out a scenario for the future in which things continue to go well, and then contemplate what the enduring elements of our military requirements might be. Now, I am known, as Vera mentioned at the outset, as something of a hardliner, as a conservative, as a skeptic about the prospects for permanent change in the Soviet Union. But I am not here today to talk about the need for prudence and caution in our national security policies. For the purposes of this discussion, set aside for now doubts about the future of Mr. Gorbachev and his reform efforts inside the Soviet Union. Don't concern yourselves with questions about instability in Eastern Europe or nationality conflicts or economic collapse or leadership changes. Rather, let's assume the following as we think about what the requirements will be for military forces and commitments for the rest of the decade. Let's assume that instead of 1990, it's now 1995. Assume that Mr. Gorbachev is still in power. Assume that his domestic policies have been at least partially successful, that his foreign policy remains far less hostile to the West than were those of his predecessors, that the U.S. and the Soviets have implemented successful arms control agreements affecting conventional and strategic forces, and that we're negotiating further agreements, that all Soviet forces have been withdrawn from Eastern Europe, that the Warsaw Pact is nothing more than a relic of history, and that Eastern Europe is governed by democratically elected non-communist regimes. Now, I would call that a rosy scenario. Furthermore, those assumptions are precisely the ones that we've used in designing our defense budget from now through 1997. I have directed the military services to plan for the mid-90s exactly based on those assumptions. The question we put to ourselves is, what if the Soviet and Warsaw Pact threat continues to erode? What kind of continuing requirements would exist for U.S. military power if we assume a vast reduction in the threat which has dictated our national strategy for the past 40 years? Given that set of assumptions, I believe there are 6 requirements that must be the foundation of national defense for now and for the period 5 years from now. The first point that must be understood is that even under the optimistic scenario, a self-absorbed, changing, inward-looking Soviet Union is going to maintain its strategic nuclear arsenal. If the Kremlin were to abandon its strategic nuclear forces, it would let go of the last real vestige of its global power. The Soviets can be expected to reshape this force to fit a START agreement, but they will probably continue their modernization program, a modernization which is now moving at a remarkable pace for a nation which is in the midst of an economic crisis. Furthermore, we're going to have to be prepared for the spread of nuclear weapons to other countries and the means to deliver them. The idea of a strategic offensive triad with weapons on land, sea, and in the air must expand to include the concept of a well-balanced mixture of offensive and defensive deterrence. Based on our advantages in technology, this new force will help us deter war by raising the uncertainty of a first strike and will protect people, elements we'll need to avoid nuclear blackmail. Secondly, we're going to want strong alliances in the coalition's defense that they give us. At the core of our national strategy and at the core of our success for the last 40 years has been our alliance relationships in Europe and those in Asia. In the future, those alliances may well play different roles. The responsibilities of the partners will probably shift. But what should not change is our fundamental commitment to coalition, unity, and strength. This is the message I took to Asia last month, a message that has been echoed by every one of our allies. Our allies recognize and believe strongly that our military presence serves a variety of ends. It dampens traditional regional tensions, and it creates a general air of security in which economies grow and democracy has the chance to thrive. We must recognize that regional security is not always connected to the level of the Soviet threat. As that threat recedes, regional calm and global economic progress will still depend on our willingness to be trusted allies. Of course, if our commitment were backed up only by words, it would be hollow. So the third enduring element of our requirement is for forward deployments. The difference between words of support and actions of conviction is that we're willing to put U.S. troops on the ground. The message to friends and enemies alike is that Americans are willing to risk their lives to ensure the security of our friends and our allies. Nothing can substitute for the stability and deterrence provided by forward deployments. It is certainly true that we will be adjusting the levels of our deployments, especially in Europe, after a CFE agreement. And we've initiated discussions with Japan and Korea that will result in a 10% reduction in U.S. forces in Asia over the next 3 years. If we manage that transition well and take advantage of our superior technology and the increasing strength of our allies, those deployments will be just as effective in the future as they are today. Fourth, no matter how politics among nations might change, geography will not. We are the leading maritime power in the world, and we will need to continue to control the seas regardless of what happens in Moscow. As circumstances change, we will adjust the kind of naval forces we need. We are now looking at a smaller Navy than we were in the early 1980s. As our economy becomes even more interwoven with those of our trading partners overseas, it's going to become more important that we maintain maritime superiority. The fifth enduring military requirement is one we have been called upon to use very recently. It's the capability to project power quickly and effectively. If we are going to defend our interests and protect American lives wherever threatened, we must have the military capability to use force in ways appropriate to the level of combat. Overwhelming nuclear superiority was of little use on the streets of Panama. We needed a well-trained, highly professional, properly equipped fighting force. We had the forces when we needed them. Our troops performed extraordinarily well, and we are going to maintain that capability and even enhance it. But the ability to project power is not just a question of combat. Instead of using force, the goal is to prevent the escalation of low-intensity conflict using security assistance and the peacetime engagement of our military in training, humanitarian assistance, civil affairs, and other contributions. The sixth and final enduring element I want to discuss today is the foundation for all the rest. As we begin the fundamental restructuring of our forces, we are going to rely as never before on our ability to generate the best technology weapons in the world. We can do that only if we pay greater attention to our eroding industrial base. If we lose our capacity to produce first-class, high-quality weaponry, we will not just have a smaller force come 1995, we will have a dangerously weaker one as well. The Soviets' inability to compete with our advanced technology is one of the primary reasons I'm convinced they've chosen to try to repair their abysmal economy. If we do not maintain that lead, we will have taken away a major reason for Mr. Gorbachev's reforms. We must not, by our own foolish actions, grant a military advantage to the Soviets that they seem to have wisely concluded is unattainable by their own efforts. So the military requirements we must maintain, no matter what the future holds, are offensive and defensive strategic forces, alliances, forward deployed forces, maritime superiority, flexible contingency forces, and a strong industrial base at home. Central to each of these requirements is the quality of our military force. Each time I get the chance to visit with our troops, as I've done in Europe, Asia, Panama, and here at home, I become more convinced than ever that the quality of our people in uniform is the basis for our success. They are the ones who put their lives on the line, and the American people expect that we will take care of them. The quality of our personnel is not something that just happens. It's the result of years of effort, making certain they are paid what they deserve, ensuring their families are taken care of, and guaranteeing that if they must fight, they have the equipment and the training to do the job. All of this costs money. It's worth every penny. As we reduce defense spending and build down our forces, we must do so with a strategy and with common sense as our guide. The slogan, "Bring the boys home," is one of our most unenlightened sentiments and probably one of the most dangerous. We should not engage in the kind of radical reductions that followed World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. Each reduction left us weaker. Each reduction had to be reversed at great cost. We are now on a prudent path to lower defense spending, one guided by a strategy and an understanding of our enduring military requirements. At the end of this period of reduction, we want to be able to look back and see that we have preserved and even enhanced these basic elements of our power. For all the mistakes we've made in the last 40 years or so, our power and influence have been a positive force in the world. Defending democracy, self-determination, and justice, these are the only reasons why the American people will ever support the exercise of our military power. President Bush said it best in his State of the Union address. America is more than a nation, it's an idea. Our Army, our Navy, our Air Force, and our Marines give us military power. Strength is essential. Without strength, our purposes will always be hostage to less benign wishes. But strength alone doesn't define our role in the world. When Lech Walesa spoke to Congress last year, and the voice of liberty he had fought so hard for, military power was not his concern. Instead, he reminded us of our real force in the world. He said, quote, "The people of Poland link the name of the United States with freedom and democracy, with generosity and high-mindedness, with human friendship and friendly humanity." These ideas are part of what it means for us to be a superpower. But the cost of maintaining the ideals that gave hope to Walesa and Václav Havel and millions of others will always be more than good words and fine intentions. In the speech he would never deliver at the Trade Mart in Dallas, President Kennedy captured this idea. Had he lived, the president would have said, "Above all, words alone are not enough. The United States is a peaceful nation, and where our strength and determination are clear, our words need merely to convey conviction, not belligerence. If we are strong, our strength will speak for itself. If we are weak, words will be of no help." Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Can you give us a scenario, any scenario, for the Soviets intentionally starting a war in Europe?
I think the likelihood of a war in Europe today involving Soviet forces is at a lower probability than at any time since the end of World War II. Clearly, the Warsaw Pact is on its way to being dismantled. The Soviets have agreed in bilateral agreements with the Hungarians and the Czechs to withdraw their troops by the middle of next year. And the prospects for a conscious decision by the Soviets to go to war in Europe, I think, extremely remote. It's not a scenario that makes a great deal of sense. Having said that, it's important for us to remember, my job as Secretary of Defense, to remind everybody there are still some 17 or 18 Soviet divisions in East Germany, a large number of Soviet troops in Poland, that we do have a lot of cause for concern in terms of the prospects for instability, if you will, in the East. And while most of those regimes have been replaced or are in the process of being replaced, we've got ethnic conflicts in Romania, as you've seen just in the last few days. And the possibility of some kind of untoward event developing there, I think, still exists. Remote, but still there. I think given the instabilities that clearly do exist and that will likely continue as we go through this transition to democratically elected regimes in Eastern Europe, we don't need to add to that instability. Adding to the instability would, in my opinion, result from an unwise, unplanned, radical reduction in the U.S. military presence currently committed to NATO. There will be time enough for us to reduce our NATO deployments. We're in the midst of negotiating an agreement to do exactly that. The President has recommended a very significant reduction in U.S. forces in Europe. But there's a way to go about that that involves first completing the negotiations with the Soviets on CFE, working out arrangements within the alliance on how we're going to take down those forces and doing it in an orderly fashion, not as a result of a decision on Capitol Hill to unilaterally bring home the boys from Europe.
We have several questions on Lithuania. What is your intelligence regarding Lithuania? Will there be a free country? Do you see a danger of violence there? And why do you think President Gorbachev has called for confiscation of weapons in Lithuania?
The situation in Lithuania obviously is of great concern, I think, to all of us. The President's made very clear his hope and expectation that they will be able to resolve the current confrontation between the Soviets and Lithuania by peaceful means. Nobody wants to see violence erupt in that part of the world. I have no way of knowing what is behind or provides the justification for the decision by Mr. Gorbachev to ask for the surrender of all of those weapons by private citizens in Lithuania. Obviously, we are watching the situation very closely with great interest. I think the Soviets must understand, probably do understand, that a resort to force under these circumstances would do enormous violence to everything that Mr. Gorbachev has said he stands for, and obviously would have a detrimental impact in the West in terms of how Gorbachev and his reforms are perceived.
What is the future of Clark Air Force Base and the Subic Naval Base in the Philippines? Is there an alternate forward deployment location which would still accomplish the same mission?
Clark and Subic are two very important facilities for us. I was just there in last month to visit both places. They are strategically located. They've been very important historically to the United States. I think they've been historically important from the standpoint of the Philippines. Our presence there provides for stability, if you will, throughout that part of the world. We would like very much to continue a relationship with the Philippines that would allow us to continue to use those facilities. But the issue is in some doubt. The negotiations will begin shortly on extending those basing rights. The question of whether or not we can do without them if we have to, I think probably is yes. We'd rather not. They're important facilities in part because of the training capabilities they offer us. We take forces from all over the Pacific to Clark and Subic to train. Air forces, naval forces, Marines on Okinawa all work out in the Philippines. There's a limit, I think, to what the U.S. can afford to pay for the privilege of continuing to operate out of the Philippines. And it's generally been my view, which I've tried to convey to my counterpart in Manila, that at a time when we are looking at closing 120 bases in the continental United States, Congress is not likely to be enamored of the notion of spending a large sum of money to keep bases open in the Philippines. So hopefully we'll be able to work out an arrangement, because I think it's in their self-interest and in our self-interest that we do so. But obviously there are limits to how far we can go in trying to accommodate their current concerns.
Have you and CIA Director Webster agreed on any joint assessment of the current Soviet threat?
Well, as a matter of fact, we have. You have to be careful here about how you use words, though, and semantics. There is a document called, that I mentioned in my speech, called the Joint Net Assessment. It's produced by the Defense Department. The Joint Chiefs spent a lot of time on it, and the intelligence community. It is our best estimate of what the current threat is, and that document is top secret, has been provided to Congress. Congress has been briefed on it, so that's up there on the Hill. That, in effect, represents, if you will, not in a personal sense, but in an institutional sense, the work of our respective agencies. Bill Webster is a good friend of mine. I've known him for many years. I think we agree on a great deal in terms of our assessment of what's happened in the past in the Soviet Union. I believe that we've got different perspectives, in part because we have different institutional responsibilities. The years that I served on the House Intelligence Committee, we used to hammer the agency all the time to give us their best guess of what was in fact going to happen. We didn't want any of this on the one hand, on the other hand kind of analysis. I understand Bill's need and obligation to give the best straightforward estimate he can give about future prospects in the Soviet Union. My perspective is different. My perspective is that of the Secretary of Defense. I've got to worry about Soviet military capabilities. I cannot worry just about intentions. I am in a position where I think caution is, in fact, the order of the day. If there's anybody in town who I would like to see, if I could back off and take myself out of my current job, if there's anybody in town who I would like to see somewhat cautious and prudent in assessing the diminution of the Soviet threat, it would be the Secretary of Defense. I think I've got an obligation to point out the possibility that things may not go smoothly with respect to reforms inside the Soviet Union, that this may not be a peaceful transition to a more democratically oriented, less hostile power than we've dealt with in the past. That does not represent a hope on my part. I hope all of the optimistic forecasts are correct. I hope that we will see Mr. Gorbachev succeed and govern for a long time, and democracy will reign inside the Soviet Union, and never again will we see a resort to military force or major military buildup or an effort to use military force to intimidate their neighbors. But I think it's far too soon for us to make the judgment that based on the developments we've seen so far, we can dismantle our defenses. I think we can, as I've directed the services to do, as I mentioned in my speech today, make assumptions about the future, and then if those assumptions come to pass, if we do in fact see current trends continue, we will be able to significantly reduce our spending on defense. But it's got to be viewed from the perspective of a reasonable time period. It should not be viewed as something that's likely to happen overnight. And I think it's probably our institutional responsibilities more than anything else that has led to the current discussion of the fact that Mr. Webster and I have slightly different perspectives on what we think may happen inside the Soviet Union.
When Virginia Governor Douglas Wilder was here the other day, he refused to take a stand on the admission of women to Virginia Military Institute. Where do you stand?
I always said Governor Wilder was a smart man. I really think that's a matter that's got to be resolved by the folks at Virginia Military Institute. And I'm not going to touch it.
Whatever happened to the list of military bases selected for reduction or closing, which was accused of having a greater effect on the congressional districts represented by Democrats? Is the shutting down in progress?
Well, let me talk about base closings for a minute. The list is still there. What I did as we go through the planning process, and remember what we're engaged in now within the department is developing the 92-97 POM. That's the Program Objective Memorandum. It's a complicated way of saying we're trying to put together the budget that we'll submit in 92 and the 6-year plan that goes with that. As we go through that process and we talk about shrinking the size of our military forces and restructuring our forces, I also directed the services to take a look at shrinking base structure. It doesn't make any sense to take down divisions in the Army or wings out of the Air Force and not close bases. Otherwise, we're going to end up in a situation 5 or 6 years from now when we don't have any forces, but we got a lot of bases. We've got to shrink it all the way down the road. So I directed the services to produce for me their recommendations on what additional bases they would want to close. Now, there are 86 bases out there now that beginning in January of this year we started to close. Those are the ones that were approved by Congress last year after the work of the Base Closing Commission. In addition to that, now we've got another list of 47. 12 of those are overseas, some 35 here in the continental United States. There may be more once we've completed the current budget activity and exercise. Those bases are subject to all the restrictions and restraints that I have to deal with as Secretary in terms of trying to close bases. Some of my predecessors never went near the subject because it just got to be too complex. I have to do 6 studies on every single one of those bases before I can make a recommendation to Congress. I have to study the economic impact and the environmental impact and the operational impact. I can then only submit the list of bases to Congress on the 3rd day of the month when the moon is full. It's not quite that bad. I can only do it once a year, and that's in January when I submit the authorization to Congress. I cannot go up in April or in July and ask Congress to close a base. I'm only allowed to do it when I submit the authorization in January. I have to submit all those studies that go along with it, and then Congress gets, I believe it's up to 60 days to overturn the decision I've made. It is I think, absolutely essential that we address the problems of bases. I think even after the Base Closing Commission, we've still got a lot of bases out there, a lot more than we need. Many of them are there or a product of the Indian Wars or the political clout of the member who represents the district. I have been accused of putting a political spin on the list of bases. I can assure you I did not do that. I have not added to or subtracted from that list of 47 except in one instance that involved a base that we were looking at in terms of potential withdrawal overseas, and after consultation with the host nation we decided to hold up for now instead of going forward with that because of some difficulties they had there. But that's the only one we changed or modified in any way from what the services recommended. The suggestion's been made that more of the bases are in Democratic districts than Republican districts. Well, I've noticed now that for nearly 40 years the Democrats have had more seats in the House of Representatives than have Republicans. So it's not surprising you'd get more in Democratic districts. The other thing to remember is that some of the closings are related to our efforts to clean up the management of the department. The Air Force Logistics Command, for example, is a prime target that Don Rice and Larry Welch are working on in terms of trying to slim down and reduce and streamline and make more efficient. Now, the Air Force Logistics Command is located at 6 air bases around the country. 5 of those 6 bases are in Democratic districts. 1 is in a Republican district. Now, there isn't any way I can deal with the problems of the Air Force Logistics Command in a managerial sense if I don't go deal with those bases. I can hardly come up and say, well, I'm only going to take 1 Republican base and 1 Democratic base, and we're going to forget the other 4, 2/3 basically of the system. So it really has not been an effort to be partisan. I served in the House long enough to know that that would not be a very productive way to proceed. If you look at my mail from my friends in the Senate, you would think that there are a number of Republican senators over there who think I wasn't partisan enough.
Why should the United States not quickly phase out its defense forces in South Korea, since that country has the economic resources to defend itself?
The Koreans have been enormously successful economically. They are increasing their contribution to paying for the cost of U.S. forces stationed in Korea. They, I think, will do even more in the future. When I was there, I discussed with my Korean counterpart the prospects of a reduction in U.S. forces in Korea and other changes as well, changes in the command structure, for example, that would turn more authority over to the Koreans for their own defense and put U.S. commanders in the second or deputy slot instead of the top slot. We're looking at a whole range of those kinds of issues, working with the Koreans, identifying which units might be affected. And we will eventually, I'm sure, take down some of those forces. But I don't think we ought to take everybody out of Korea. I think it's important to remember that if there's any place in the world where a spark could trigger a conflict tomorrow, and where we have had, unfortunately, in the experience, our own experiences in the post-war period, a major conflict that cost thousands of American lives, it's Korea. It's the one place where we could wake up tomorrow morning and see a major assault by a hostile force against U.S. forces. And I think we have to be very careful not to allow that to happen. So as we allow the Koreans and encourage the Koreans to take more of the burden, and as we reduce our own presence there, I think it's important that we do so gradually, carefully, cautiously, and never give the North Koreans reason to believe that there's any reduction in our commitment, any lessening of our commitment to protect and preserve the security of South Korea. That's been one of the great success stories in the post-war period, and I don't see any reason for us to give it up. The other point to be made is that we have some capabilities in terms of our air capability, intelligence capabilities and so forth that are a very important and integral part of the defense of South Korea, capabilities the South Koreans do not yet have. Their recent agreement to upgrade their aircraft by buying 120 F-18s, co-producing some of those in South Korea, will go a long way towards improving that capability. I think eventually we'll be able to go even further. But for now, I think we've got a prudent plan for gradual reductions. I think it's important that those reductions be carefully and carefully, cautiously done.
We have quite a few questions about press coverage of the invasion of Panama. This one is typical. Do you think you made a mistake by activating the Pentagon press pool so late that it was not able to cover the key opening battles of the invasion? Will you ensure that the press is able to cover the beginning of future military operations?
Let me talk about that for a minute. It's an important subject and needless to say, an interesting one. I am the official who made the decision about the timing, when the call-out notice would go to the pool, how the pool would be employed, etc. So if anybody's unhappy with the way it was handled, I'm the guy who has to accept the responsibility for that. And I would not stand here today and say that we handled it perfectly. I'm sure that if we are willing to work on it, we can find ways to improve it. But there are a couple of things you need to be aware of in terms of my own approach to the process. Decision to undertake Operation Just Cause was made on a Sunday afternoon. The H hour was scheduled for 1 o'clock on a Wednesday morning. Throughout that period of time, we had to be concerned with the possibility that a premature leak would in fact compromise the security of the operation. And it was an enormously complex operation, flying thousands of men and women thousands of miles to Panama, undertaking a very complex military operation, some 27 different targets, doing it in the dead of night, people jumping out of airplanes from 500 feet without reserve chutes, etc. Any premature disclosure obviously ran the risk of possibly compromising security of the operation, raised the prospects of the Panamanian Defense Forces being ready for us when we arrived, heightened the possibility that we would suffer more casualties than we did. I wanted to avoid that. There was another complicating factor, which was the weather. We were told on Monday that it was conceivable that we might have to delay the operation because of icing in North Carolina, where the 82nd Airborne was taking off, and that we might in fact not be able to do the operation Wednesday morning. It could conceivably get pushed off 24 hours. For all of those reasons, I made the decision to delay the call out to the press pool. And we then made the call out after the evening news cycle on Tuesday night. I wished it could have been otherwise. My own view, though, is that given the responsibilities and obligations I have, that I made the right call. If I am faced with a choice that could affect the life of a single serviceman sent into combat by my instructions under those circumstances versus taking care of the legitimate concerns of the press, I am always going to feel my first obligation is to protect the life of that serviceman.
The $800 million foreign aid request for Panama and Nicaragua must be financed by cuts in the defense budget. Where will these cuts be made?
We have a number of pots of money, if you will, projects, line items in the budget that have been added over the years. Some are administration programs, some were programs added by the Congress. We're now in the midst of negotiating with the appropriations committees in both houses to identify sources to fund Panama and Nicaragua. the assistance packages. One place to look, for example, are the deferral requests we sent up earlier this year to the appropriations committees. And we're in the midst of negotiating with them. There's a list that's would be happy to provide anybody if they want to look at it in detail. There are a large number of items on the list that we think we can do without, or that we can delay or defer, and we'll use those sources of funding to finance the President's assistance package for those two countries.
There has been a recent published report that the uniformed chiefs feel that they're not sufficiently consulted in DoD decisions. Is this a valid criticism?
No. Obviously the task of managing the department, as big as it is and as complicated as it is, and dealing with it at a time when we are forced to go through this wrenching process of deciding what we're going to give up, what we're not going to buy, what ships we're going to mothball, what divisions we're going to deactivate, isn't pleasant business. From my standpoint, as somebody who, as a member of Congress, voted for every single defense program, I never saw a defense program I didn't like as a member of Congress. Now having to pay for them in a time of shrinking budgets is a very different proposition. I'm having to make some very difficult decisions, not pleasant decisions by any means. There are bound to be individuals and organizations within the department who won't like the kinds of decisions I make. But I've done my best to allow everybody who has a legitimate reason to participate in that exercise to do so. And my own experience with the chiefs has been that they have been very good and very effective participants in the process. Now, obviously, they don't win all the battles, but they do, I think, have the opportunity to make their cases known to me and to Don Atwood and John Betty and the other senior civilians involved. And they have been, I think, very effective in presenting their case on an individual service-by-service basis. And they have been very effective generally in terms of implementing the decisions once they're made. We've still got a long way to go. We are not yet down to the President's top line for the out years. And to get down to that level is going to require some very, very tough decisions, and we're having to give up some things that for a long time the Department thought it was going to have. There's bound to be some unrest as we go through that process, but I would hope that nearly everybody feels they've had an opportunity to have their say before the decisions get made.
What are Soviet forces doing off the coast of northern Norway?
I would need more information than that in terms of responding specifically to that. Obviously, northern Norway is up around the Murman coast. It's not that far from the northern part of the Soviet Union. I'm sure they're active naval standpoint up there, but I'm unaware of any other presence.
Do you plan to follow the lead of Secretary of State Baker and meet with New Zealand officials either here or in New Zealand?
As an avid trout fisherman, I've been trying for years to figure out a way to get to New Zealand. But I don't think it's likely to happen in my current job. We do not any longer have a security relationship with New Zealand. That all focuses upon their refusal to allow U.S. ships to call in their harbor, and that position at present remains unchanged. Jim met with his counterpart on a very specific matter, but that shouldn't be taken as an indication that now there's a warm relationship between, for example, our Department of Defense and our counterparts in New Zealand. There isn't.
Do you think we should limit or ban weapons in space under future arms control treaties?
I do not think we ought to ban weapons in space under future arms control treaties. I think it should come as a surprise to no one here. I'm a big advocate of Strategic Defense Initiative. I think it's an enormously important capability. I think we can develop and deploy that capability in the not too distant future, and I would not favor an international agreement that interfered with our capacity to deploy those kinds of defenses.
Will the defense stockpile of critical materials become more or less important in today's international climate?
Well, it's not clear at this point how current developments might lead us to change the stockpile, I frankly haven't looked at it very closely. We are in the process of reviewing a whole raft of considerations in light of the change in Europe, in light of the expectations of a CFE agreement, etc. If you begin to talk about longer warning times, you've got more time to mobilize, it might be that we could afford to reduce the stockpile of critical materials in the future, but that's an off the top of my head kind of response. It might be that as you cut back in terms of actual production that you'd want to stockpile more things. I haven't at this point looked at it closely enough to have a firm opinion.
Hypothetically, how fast can you take the force structure down? How many divisions can be cut, and how quickly without damaging those remaining?
Well, the key thing to keep in mind, if you come back to the proposition I try to make in my remarks, that our number one military asset is people, those folks who put on the uniform and, if necessary, go in harm's way. All volunteer force. We don't have a large number of draftees ready to go home. It's not like Vietnam or Korea, the end of World War II. Everybody wearing the uniform today is there because they want to be wearing the uniform. They've all got contracts with us. And so how we treat them is going to have a big impact on our continued ability to recruit and retain first-class people to serve in the military. Everybody, I think, in the department and the services recognizes we're going to have a smaller military. General Powell's fond of saying, and I wholeheartedly concur with him, that we will take the force down to whatever level the country is willing to support. But at that level, we want the most ready, most capable, most well-trained force we can deploy. Doing that means that there's a certain pace at which we take down the force. If you do it radically and abruptly and suddenly, if, for example, we're unsuccessful in our current effort to get reprogramming authority from Congress to protect the military personnel account for fiscal year 90, we will have to lay off somewhere between 60 and 70,000 uniformed personnel in the next couple of months. Freeze promotions, stop all permanent change of station moves for thousands of personnel. That is a goofy way to run an operation if you want to treat people well, if you want them to feel like they've been treated well, if you want to be able to get them to continue to serve in the future. By the same token, you've got some obligation that if you're going to take individuals who put in 8 or 12 years in the military, who are now going to be told you no longer require their services because you're shrinking the size of the force, you've got an obligation to treat them right and handle that very painful process just as carefully and as humanely as possible. So there is a legitimate break, if you will, on the rate at which we can reduce the force. The numbers that we have recommended, 2 divisions out of the Army, for example, in 1991 is about as fast as I think we ought to go. If you do it much more rapidly than that, then you are going to be in the business of having to do things that do enormous violence to your personnel policy, and I'd like to avoid that. We can, over the next 4 or 5 years, save a lot of money. The way you save money in our budget, given the fact that about 46% of it is manpower or manpower related, is to reduce force structure, and reduce the size of the force. But that has to be done carefully and cautiously, and it ought to be done gradually over time. It shouldn't all be done in the first year.
I believe the service vice chiefs testified last year that you could take it down 10% a year. Do you agree with that?
I would be strongly influenced by their views. That sounds to me like that's about right.
What will we do about all those short-range nuclear attack missiles we were going to point at Eastern Europe? Why do we need them now?
I assume this refers to the follow-on to Lance proposition. We do have in the budget money to modernize, if you will, or upgrade our system, deploy a new system of short-range missiles, nuclear missiles. That is there as part of an alliance policy. This isn't a decision the United States made unilaterally. The NATO alliance is committed to the comprehensive concept approved last May by the heads of government. It basically says we want to maintain modern, up-to-date forces across the broad spectrum of capabilities, including nuclear forces. That is the alliance policy today. We've agreed that there will be negotiations on short-range nuclear forces once we've completed a CFE agreement. And I think whatever we do with respect to follow-on to Lance should be done within the framework of the alliance, shouldn't be done unilaterally by the United States.
Do you think that President Reagan was overly optimistic in his 1983 SDI speech when he pronounced the objective of SDI was to make offensive nuclear weapons obsolete. Aren't there always going to be effective countermeasures that will preclude a 100% defensive shield?
I can't say that we are capable near term of producing a 100% effective shield against nuclear weapons. If we deploy chiefs that would allow us to intercept approximately 40% of the first wave attack, about 50% of all the SS-18s, that capability in and of itself adds enormously to deterrence. The prospect of countermeasures to SDI obviously is something we spend a lot of time on. I think we will be able to deploy defenses, and that the countermeasures to those defenses will be so expensive that it wouldn't be worth the effort for the Soviets to engage in trying to overcome them. Even more important, I would hope, is that we will make the transition from a security system that relies only upon our ability to put nuclear weapons on the other guy to a system in which we can also have a significant component of defense involved. And our ability to defend against attacks, whether it's to deter a Soviet attack, which is our prime objective, or whether it's to be able to defend against an actual attack from some other third world country. Given the proliferation of ballistic missile technology in key parts of the world, the proliferation of chemical and perhaps even nuclear weapons over the next 10 years, it's going to be increasingly important for us, I think, to have that defensive capability, not only in terms of the U.S., but especially our allies overseas and forward deployed forces. For all of those reasons, I think it's important to go forward with defenses, and I think saying that SDI has to be 100% effective against any attack sets up a standard that no system could meet or should be asked to meet. If it adds significantly to deterrence, and it does it at a cost that we can afford, it seems to me it makes far more sense to start down that road of building defenses, working out an arrangement with the Soviets that will allow that kind of transition, rather than buying more and more nukes to drop on the other guy.
Mr. Secretary, before asking you the last question, I would like to present you with a certificate of appreciation from the National Press Club, and with a handy-dandy National Press Club mug for those long hours at the Pentagon. There is a story going around that before Secretary Cheney worked in the Ford White House, that he had pronounced his name Cheney. But when President Ford called him Cheney, he said, well, if the president says that's my name, it's Cheney, and it has been ever since. Is this true?
Well, there's a funny story in that that my wife Lynn likes to tell, and that is the time we were at a family reunion, and we'd been married just a few years, and she was always puzzled because sometimes people said Cheney and sometimes people said Cheney. So she went to my elderly uncle, who was sort of the repository of all lore about the family, and she asked him, she said, is it Cheney or is it Cheney? And he said, it's Cheney. She said, well, thank you very much. It's always wanted to get that issue resolved. She said, that's a very nice dog you have there. What kind of dog is it? He said, it's a bagel.
If you'd like to see this program again, tune in at midnight Eastern Time Sunday for a re-air of Secretary Cheney's speech. In a moment, Director of the Office of Management and Budget, Richard Darman, meets with Senator Kent Conrad from North Dakota.
Chinese students were shot in Tiananmen Square. East Germans flee to the West to seek a better life. Inalienable rights are what America stands for and what we are obliged to protect.
These are the words of Peter Lane, winner of the $5,000 first prize in C-SPAN's National College Scholarship Competition. Students around the country whose teachers are members of C-SPAN in the classroom were asked to answer the question, why is the government taking so long to pass anti-drug legislation? As if they were a member of the U.S. House of Representatives on a C-SPAN call-in program. Second prize winner, Jennifer Rother, wrote,
If we adopt a bad law, or one that doesn't solve anything, it can even be more dangerous than drugs themselves.
And third prize winner, Michelle Wojcik, thought,
We must figure out a way to protect our children and make our communities safer, without abridging basic rights critical to our most basic values as citizens.
We salute the winners and all who participated for their knowledge of the democratic process at work. C-SPAN, open to the public.
Go behind the scenes of the events and issues you've been following on C-SPAN. Subscribe to the C-SPAN Update. Designed with the C-SPAN viewer in mind, the update offers you articles about the programs we air, profiles of Washington insiders, and C-SPAN program information. Our redesigned schedule page is easy to read and features highlights of the week you won't want to miss. So call now. Just $24 brings you 50 issues of the C-SPAN Update. Dial 1-800-346-8800. If you call now, C-SPAN will send you a free gift. Gavel to Gavel, the guide to daily business in the House and Senate. Call 1-800-346-8800 and we'll send you both 50 issues of the C-SPAN Update and Gavel to Gavel for just $24. Isn't it time you got an update?